But how do we do that? How do we reach the group mind and shake the crowd from its slumber? Group psychology is a weapon, and like all weapons, it is capable of being used for good or for evil. For many years, it has been in the wrong hands. It has been hidden from the public and used against them. It's time for the people to pick up that weapon and use it to free themselves. It's time to start studying. Read Gustave Le Bon's books, The Crowd and Psychology of Revolution. Read Edward Bernays' books, Propaganda and Crystallizing Public Opinion. And read Gene Sharp's books, From Dictatorship to Democracy and National Security Through Civilian-Based Defense. Learn the theory, learn the techniques, and start using them to spread the truth rather than hiding it. Start using them to prevent wars rather than start them. Start using them to stop the militarization of the police and to end the surveillance state. Use them to bring this corporate mafia to its knees. Some of you may find this proposition frightening. This is dangerous stuff. These are ideological M16s with boxes of ammunition. If even a few motivated individuals started using these techniques effectively, it could seriously disrupt the balance of power. But that is exactly what's needed. I challenge you to look around. Look at the state of the world. Look at where these psychopaths are taking us. If you do not feel the imperative to change the course that we are on, then you're not paying attention.
And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around.
But for now, you, aspiring ruler, may be disgusted by the world of politics and have decided to avoid it entirely. But you cannot, for rulers come in many forms. Yes, kings, presidents, and prime ministers, but also deans, dons, mayors, chairs, chiefs. These rules apply to all and explain their actions, from the CEO of the largest global corporate conglomerate who must keep his board happy to the chair of the smallest homeowners association, managing votes and spending membership fees. You cannot escape structures of power. You can only turn a blind eye to understanding them. And if you ever want the change you dream about, there's a zeroth rule you cannot ignore. Without power, you can affect nothing.
All nation-states owe their existence to a monopoly on violence, but only a dying nation is forced to expose that fact. The United States is a nation in its death throes. In this video, we're going to explain why. During times of stability, there are three monopolies that maintain the power of the state. Three pillars of power that all governments depend on. 1, the control of ideas and belief. 2, the control of money and finance. And 3, the monopoly on violence. Most people would never consider laws and legal systems as the control of ideas. But did you ever consider what makes the law any different than any other note that you might write on a piece of paper? The answer is belief. The belief in the legitimacy of a government and its subsequent right to impose limits and requirements on the behavior of the people is all that gives written law the illusion of power. I know what you might be thinking, but the police enforce those laws, and if I don't comply, they throw me in a cage. Indeed they do, but why? Why does a policeman feel that he has the right to do this? Why does the average citizen feel that they have the obligation to comply? And why does the rest of the population feel that they don't have the right to stop the man with the badge from grabbing a citizen and putting him in jail? It's because the policeman, the citizen, and the rest of society are mesmerized by their belief in authority. It all comes down to belief. The control of belief is actually the linchpin that makes the other three monopolies possible.
And the thing that we're going to be exploring is called a frame. And you'll see that in a lot of ways, the Game of Thrones is really a game of frames. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First off, what is a frame? A frame is basically all of the unstated beliefs that give context to any interaction. The frame gives meaning to the words that we say. So the difference between me saying cool and saying cool comes from the belief that I have when I say that word. The first thing that I want to talk about is the importance of frames when trying to convince someone of anything.
For many millennia, the church worked in tandem with the state to help maintain the fabric of belief by supporting the doctrine of the divine right of kings. Today, that role is filled by the media and the education system. Television has become the temple of the 21st century. Newscasters, the priest, selling us the divine right of the state in the guise of democracy, and state-run schools complete the job by teaching a philosophy that legitimizes state violence without ever questioning the moral foundations of that paradigm. But this situation is rapidly changing. The US government's aura of legitimacy has been severely tarnished, and the awareness of that stain is spreading like a virus throughout society as more and more people turn away from the mainstream media. The control of belief, which has for so long been used to lend support to the power elite, is rapidly slipping from their hands. They've lost control of the dialogue. This is why the government keeps trying to get control of the internet. In the United States, as is the case in the majority of the world, the control of money is no longer held by the government. This power was handed over to the Federal Reserve in 1913, and the Federal Reserve is owned by a conglomerate of the most powerful private banks in the world. By giving the power to coin money to private banks, a new branch of government was created, one that is not at all accountable to the people, and which cannot be voted out of office. This is the essence of fascism, the merger of corporate and government power. But what is money anyway? We can talk about the technicalities of what a dollar is today, and how it is essentially a unit of debt, backed by nothing, created out of thin air. And we can discuss what it used to be. But what is the underlying principle? What is the common denominator between paper money, digital money, metal money, and the cacao beans used by the ancient Mayans for money? The answer, once again, is belief. People give their labor and their goods in exchange for money because they have faith that they will be able to use that money to obtain labor and goods from others in the future. It is this faith that actually creates what we call value. However, the belief that a unit of currency is valuable can only be maintained if certain conditions are met. Either the substance itself has to have some inherent usefulness, as was the case for cacao beans of the Mayans, or there must be something that creates an artificial demand for the currency, such as forced taxation. In the case of the US dollar, the fact that oil can only be purchased in the global market using US dollars creates this artificial demand on the international level. But this is a topic in and of itself. In either case, the quantity of the currency must not grow too quickly, or forces of supply and demand will cause the perceived value to drop. Outside the petrodollar anomaly, forced taxation is the primary method used by states to generate the artificial demand for the official currency. Without the official demand that taxes be paid in a specific currency, communities would have nothing preventing them from creating their own currencies, which cut out the banker middlemen. Forced taxation seems non-violent to most people because they choose to comply. However, most people aren't aware of the fact that they're making a choice by complying. They have come to believe that compliance is an obligation. But this is just another example of the control of belief making violence unnecessary in most cases. However, if one refuses to comply with these taxes, what happens? Agents of the state come to put you in a cage. They don't do this for financial reasons. Imprisoning tax resistors costs the state many times more than they could ever hope to recover. They put you in prison to make an example out of you, and to strike fear in the hearts of all those who might be thinking of doing the same. So you see, the states actually use the monopoly on violence to maintain the control of belief and the control of money. And the flip side of that equation is also true. It's circular. Essentially, the three pillars of power all lean in on each other, and if any one of them is removed, they all come falling down. The monopoly on violence has also been blurred in the United States as military defense contractors such as Blackwater operate private armies in theaters of war and domestically, as was the case in Hurricane Katrina. The use of mercenaries is nothing new. It's a practice as old as prostitution, and almost as dignified. But what is new is the immense financial power and political influence that these mercenary armies and the military-industrial complex in general has accumulated. Combine that with an unfettered revolving door between the war industry and the government, and you have a recipe for disaster. It shouldn't be surprising what you get when an industry which depends on war for survival has influence over the government. In the United States, all three pillars of power have fallen into corporate hands. This is fascism, pure and simple. Corporations are not moral citizens. Their only interest is the bottom line. As such, the rule of law has been brushed aside. From the perspective of a multinational corporation, such details are just pesky obstacles. But this trend towards corruption has consequences. It has eroded the faith and belief of the people in the legitimacy of the government. It has led to rampant looting of the treasury, massive money printing, and a national debt of over $16 trillion and growing faster by the day. Just the financial aspect of this equation is enough to guarantee a collapse. At this point, it cannot be fixed, but it can be prolonged, and that's why we're seeing these endless wars. These are desperate attempts to maintain American global dominance and to prevent a move away from the dollar. In summary, fascism has corrupted all three pillars of power in the United States, and as a result, those pillars are crumbling. Those that are running the system can see this. They can see it and they're scared, because they know at this point, there's nothing they can do to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. All they have left is a monopoly on violence, and that monopoly is not complete. The founders of the United States wanted to make sure that the government had to share that power with the people, hence they created the Second Amendment. How then is a corrupt government which has abandoned the rule of law and the aura of legitimacy that came with it to hold on to power as the house of cards comes tumbling down? The answer should be obvious. They have to take away the counterbalance of the Second Amendment, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. There's just one little problem with this proposition. For many Americans who have been watching with growing distrust as their country becomes more and more of a police state, the Second Amendment is their line in the sand. Taking that right away, even incrementally, is actually accelerating the awakening of the public. And in the process, the enforcement arm of the government is beginning to question the chain of command. Without their enforcement arm, what power will the government have? None whatsoever. That's when the current system will draw its final breath, and the people will be left to decide how we're going to rebuild. But it's important to understand here that the state is not going to go down without a fight. They see the shift in ideas. They see the growing resistance to their dominance. And they see us reaching out to the police and military. They see the police and military that are waking up in droves. The scores of sheriffs that have already begun publicly stating that they will not allow the enforcement of new gun laws in their county. That's why in places like the West Point Military School, they're attempting to categorize anti-federal government activists in with terrorists. It's a desperate move. One that could backfire. But we can't afford to be passive and hope that it backfires. We have to make sure that it backfires. We have to keep up the pressure. We have to keep reaching out to the police and military, reminding them of the oath that they took to defend the Constitution and what that means.
Revolutions begin with a no, and they end with a yes. Revolutions begin when you say no to those who claim to have power over you. And revolutions end when you accept a new status quo, a new normal, whether that new normal is an improvement or not. The causes of revolution are numerous in form, but there is one common root, and that's discontent. Discontent is the emotion that builds and builds under the surface. It is a storm which brews in the mind of the people, just waiting to be unleashed. The trouble is that it's much easier to unleash that storm than it is to get people in agreement as to what should come next. It's not easy to get people to see eye to eye regarding what needs to happen after the current system falls. So this is usually put off, or avoided altogether. And that's a serious mistake. Without clear objectives, chaos usually sets in soon after the old regime falls. And then, in the power vacuum that's created, a tyrant rises to bring order. As a result, the systems that follow revolutions are often just as totalitarian or more totalitarian than those that they replace. It should therefore be abundantly obvious that discontent is not a sufficient driving force for a revolution. That is, if your goal is to actually leave a better world for your children and grandchildren. The movement is only successful if it starts with an idea that is strong enough to take root in the mind of the population and inspires and motivates people to spread it. It is possible for a diverse and divided people to form a coalition in times of great need and unify around an idea, but it only works if that idea meets the following three requirements. 1. It must articulate a clear and defined common interest which allow the people to work together. The necessity for unification, even if that unification is temporary, needs to be evident to all stakeholders, and it must be accompanied by a sense of urgency which impels people to reach out to others in their community and spread the idea. 2. A clear vision of what you're working towards. What are you going to replace the current system with? Ironing out the fine details isn't actually productive. What's needed is a broad and abstract vision based on principles. In human societies, extreme and abrupt changes are usually destructive. All efforts must be made to retain social stability. And this means steering clear of any sort of utopian fantasies. The time to rewire humanity is not during a period of crisis. Historically, such attempts usually end in tragedy. 3. A plan of action and a clear understanding of the rules of engagement. We'll refer to these three elements collectively as the conscious revolution paradigm. You don't have to get mystical about it, it just means think before you act. Let's start with the common interest. Establishing the common interest is easy if you're informed, and if the people around you aren't informed, then your job is clear. Inform them. Well, imagine a network of small, voluntarily formed communities bound together in loose federations that cooperate for mutual defense and trade as needed, with decision-making taking place at the local level. It's a simple concept, one that's been applied many times throughout history. The most striking example, however, is the Iroquois Federation, which unified 6 tribes, each with their own cultures and traditions. The Iroquois Federation existed before the arrival of Columbus and lasted until 1779 when they were conquered militarily by the US. Many historians believe that the Iroquois Federation served as the original inspiration for the United States. The most striking difference being that the Iroquois Federation never had a central government. The final element of the conscious revolution paradigm is the plan of action, strategy and tactics, the short-term and long-term goals, and the structure of the movement. So let's start with the top-level strategy and move towards tactics. Some think of revolution in terms of bullets and bombs, but this is a misconception. Revolutions are about pulling the pillars of power out from underneath the state, one by one, until it falls. The state leans on 3 primary pillars of power. 1, the control of the group mind, ideas, and beliefs. 2, the control of money, finance, and thereby human activity. And 3, the monopoly on violence and the use of intimidation to extract obedience by fear. There are 3 stages of revolution, and they are sequential, and they correlate directly with the 3 pillars of power. The first is the ideological revolution. This is where we undermine the belief systems which support their control. This is where we systematically erode their illusion of legitimacy, their aura of power.
Now that he's broken their frame and at least gotten them to listen, he can begin to persuade them. And if you're interested, I can cover the full list of persuasion tactics that Tyrion uses because there are many, but suffice to say that if someone is being resistant while you're trying to persuade them, the answer is not to just go over and over again down the same path. You need to disrupt their pattern, you need to reframe them, and then you can begin to speak to their interest and speak more logically. He totally breaks this guy's frame with humor. See the laughter there? In this frame and in real life too, laughter is a telltale sign that someone has had their frame shifted. Usually it's the person who is laughing that has had their way of viewing the world disrupted. In these moments, right after someone has shifted their frame is when they are most open to being persuaded. So the lesson here for your own life, nothing to do with Game of Thrones, is that if you're trying to persuade someone and they're being resistant, don't just keep pushing. Instead, you need to reframe them, and humor is a great way to do it.
The second phase of the revolution is strategic noncompliance, or more accurately, defiance. This can take many forms and multiple approaches can be used at the same time. The goal of strategic noncompliance is to interrupt the chain of obedience for as long as possible, as many times as possible, to publicize that interruption on as large of a scale as possible, to document the police and/or military brutality that follows, and to distribute that footage far and wide. The purpose of this is to damage the ruling party's image, because power is all about image. It's all smoke and mirrors. Once that image starts to break down, this inspires others to disobey. Monkey see, monkey do. And when this catches on and contagion sets in, it becomes a force of nature, like a tidal wave. It's all about reaching critical mass. What's crucial to understand here is that revolutions are almost entirely psychological in nature. In this context, building confidence is the most important element. Therefore, it's better to do small, successful operations and build up from there than it is to start with large, high-stakes events. The third stage of the revolution comes when the people have built up the necessary momentum to take the monopoly on violence out of the hands of the current regime. In the best of circumstances, such a transition can be relatively peaceful. But this is only possible when a significant portion of the police and the military have taken the side of the people. The police and military are the enforcement arm of the state, and without them, the powers that be have no power at all. Faltering governments almost always resort to brutal repression to attempt to stay in power. But this is often a fatal error. Even one refusal to follow an immoral order can set off a chain reaction that destroys the illusion of authority that they so carefully cultivate. Once that happens, it's game over. In East Germany on November 7, 1989, the Communist Party ordered the military to put a stop to mass protests which had been growing throughout that year. The commander of the army refused, and he ordered his men to stand down. This sent a clear message that the Communist Party was no longer in control. This realization spread quickly through the population, and communism fell. Now, since this is such a crucial element in the equation, it's not something that should be left up to chance. Every effort needs to be made right now to reach out to the police and military, to help them wake up to what's going on, and to let them know that the people will support them if they break the chain of command. Leadership takes many forms and can mean many things depending on the situation. However, the primary job of leaders is to inspire people to take action, to organize people into groups so they can be more effective than isolated individuals, and to train others to do the same. Now, the final element you need to start your revolution is tactics. In the realm of violence, the state has a definitive advantage, and it would be foolish to engage them where they are strongest. Instead, we should use tactics that engage them where they are weakest. Fortunately, there's no shortage of nonviolent tactics which have been proven effective in toppling dictatorships. Gene Sharp's book From Dictatorship to Democracy lists 198, but those are by no means the only ones that can be used. The tactics employed by each group will depend on the mission and the specific goals of the group. The military divides itself into Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine so that each can be specialized in the tactics of the terrain where they fight. Likewise, a nonviolent movement should have specialized groups for specific issues.